So, Lindsay Tanner, good morning. Who are you saying has dumbed down democracy?
Well, the only thing missing from that was my performance on the footy show. This is actually what my book Sideshow is all about, Barry, and the question you've got to ask is, why are politicians behaving like that? Certainly far more than perhaps they did 20 or 30 years ago. And the answer is, that's what gets media coverage. So if the media portray politics as entertainment, don't be surprised if politicians start behaving like entertainers in order to get coverage. Media coverage is the oxygen of politics. If you don't get it, you don't exist. If you've got to behave like that to get coverage, you do.
So the media made me do it. That's the explanation.
The media are the key drivers. Politicians obviously play a role. They've got choices, but the media set the ground rules. And one of the lamest excuses that I've got, and I've heard it before, in response to my criticisms of the media is, oh, we're just the messenger, don't shoot the messenger. Well, the media actually create the message. They decide whether I or somebody like me gets access to the media, what they portray, what I've said gets put there, whether it's distorted or not, or whether or not I get completely ignored. So I have to play by their rules. And all politicians know this, and that's why you get that kind of behaviour.
Yeah, but it's one thing to say you need to be part of the entertainment industry. It's another to look like a clown.
Oh, true, but if the alternative is no one knows you exist, you've got no choice. You have to play by those rules, because the one thing that will guarantee that you will not succeed as a politician is nobody ever having heard of you. So if the rules of the game are put on a funny hat, dance the Macarena, put on a tutu in order to get coverage, that's what people do.
Yeah, but I just get the feeling, though, that these days politicians prefer to go on the light entertainment programs. They knock the door down to get onto those programs, and it's harder. It's harder these days to get people on serious programs.
The reason they do that is because of the fact that serious content is slowly draining out of media coverage. There are islands of good coverage, of which the ABC is one, but it's not subject to the same commercial pressures as the commercial media. The reason that politicians try to get on those light entertainment programs is because half the population is getting not much else in terms of content about them. So they've got to go where the people are, because the means of getting a serious message out has shrunk back to, in effect, a minority set of outlets that really broadcast and publish to a minority audience.
Yeah, maybe, but they also avoid the interrogation if they go onto those programs rather than the more serious programs.
Well, and there's a very good reason for that, Barry, and that is that they have no confidence that what they say will not be grossly distorted and misrepresented. It's already happened to me with respect to this book only in the past week or so, that what happens is that most media outlets now routinely distort and manipulate content to beat it within an inch of its life into something that is totally unrepresentative of what was said or what was meant, in order to make it entertaining and stimulating and titillating. So politicians are naturally nervous about how they're going to be portrayed. That's why you get spin. That's where spin came from. That's why you get people with scripts. That's why you get politicians sounding like robots. They're defending themselves.
I wonder, though, whether most politicians go onto these programs to sort of try and turn a vote, or do they do it just to raise their own profiles?
Oh, all of the above. That politics depends on publicity. When you've got a democracy, when you've got compulsory voting, then the key to getting support is people knowing who you are and having some sense of what you're about. That's why politicians are always desperate to get into the media. And the problem is that the ground rules have been changing for some time, getting less and less serious, more and more distorted, more and more focused on entertainment, and the end result is politicians have responded to that. Just as when you change the football rules, players change the way they play.
Yeah, but if we get a little nostalgic for a moment, I recall the times when ministers would never speak outside of their portfolio responsibilities. Now they do, on everything and anything, and they become more commentators and analysts than politicians.
Look, I think that's probably a fair comment, and one of the reasons for that is that they get rewarded for doing so by extra publicity and become personalities like Barnaby Joyce, for example, and whatever internal damage they may suffer as a result of it falls into the shade. It's nowhere near as significant. So in other words, the equation's a positive one for them. You make yourself a high-profile personality, and that media coverage and popular recognition will drive your career, and the question of whether or not you're playing by internal party rules doesn't matter that much.
I wonder if it is a positive, because there was a time when you clearly knew who the Minister for Finance was, the Minister for Trade, Minister for Social Security. Now they seem to have lost that credibility. You don't identify them naturally. with who they are and what their responsibilities
it's
are.
certainly not a positive for serious democracy, and that, in a sense, is the point of my book, is that the seriousness and the connection between the ordinary citizen and what's going on in the political process, actual decisions, actual issues, is draining away. So it's definitely not a positive for a functioning democracy. We're heading towards a world where the question of who governs Australia is going to be determined by questions like what Tony Abbott looks like in Speedos or whether Julia Gillard cried after the Queensland floods. Both of which have got absolutely nothing to do with the big decisions, the big challenges, the issues, the strategies that ultimately are what politicians are there for.
Why though, aren't senior people resisting this more often? Like, when you were in the ministry, you would be taken out of caucus and given talking points for the day. They could be across any issue, unrelated to finance, and you took on that responsibility. You were the spruiker for the day.
Look, some people obviously play by these rules more than others, so there is some degree of variety, but ultimately everybody is subject to the same pressures, and I don't claim to be pure. I played by those rules. I tried to push back a bit. Maybe I could have done more, but everybody ultimately is in the game of getting forward. Politicians are exactly like everybody else. They try and do things that will get rewarded, and they try and avoid doing things that will get punished. And when all the signals say, play the clown, be flamboyant, and don't say anything that can be misrepresented, look like you're doing something, and don't offend anybody who matters, well, guess what? They respond to those signals and play by those rules, and I don't claim to have been any different from others.
And when you say one of the mantras now is don't offend anybody who matters, Graham Richardson says the opposite, that right now this government is offending just about everybody.
Look, well, in a macro sense, that's possibly right, but I mean in a specific sense of what you say and how you say it, so that every time you're confronted with sets of issues, the first thing you have to think about was how do I be careful about what I say so that nothing here is going to have media the following day with, Tanner attacks pharmacists or Tanner attacks golf club members or whatever. So obviously policy decisions invariably upset people, and often you're confronted with decisions which are going to upset someone no matter which way you go. But what I'm trying to say is that the way presentation occurs, and it is affecting decision making, is very much driven by avoiding offending people. And the key reason is that those with grievances get their grievances massively magnified, distorted, built up out of all proportion to the merit and the content of those grievances, because that sells newspapers and wins ratings, and it impacts on the way politics works.
And this idea that you have to win the micro-argument every day, and that's why you had a team of people who'd get up before dawn and put together a kind of strategy for the day. That's relatively new. That's not the way that John Howard operated.
Look, I think that John Howard drifted into that zone in the latter part of his career, but certainly you're right, it's relatively new. You could argue that it's self-defeating, and I'm hopeful that part of the problem I'm identifying is a bit cyclical, so that we're starting to see maybe some early signs of a bit of pushback. But that politics of the moment, as I call it, I think is dreadful, because what it means is that...
Didn't Kevin Rudd invent that?
No, I don't think he did. I think it's been around for longer than that, and I think it's just something that's been mounting and mounting and mounting, and it's very much a product of digital media, the internet, pay TV, the emergence of a 24-hour, 7 days a week, instantaneous news cycle, which means that you are always under intense pressure, you are always under siege, and therefore you have no alternative but to focus intently on today's micro battle.
Yeah, but it just seems in the 2007 election, when John Howard was still Prime Minister, he had big issues like, and you talk about this in the book, you had work choices in Iraq and issues like that, and then you get to 2010, and where did all the substance go? It was all spin and marketing.
Look, well, I think it's true to say it's got worse. But I don't think it's just something that's emerged recently. And these problems are time immemorial. They've been in politics forever. I'm just suggesting that they've got a lot worse. And I think really over the past decade or so, you can't pinpoint a specific point and say this is where the switch got flicked from serious to vaudeville. But the problem has got a lot worse. And although I think possibly you'll see some pushback from consumer demand, I think the big increase in the Green vote in the last election was very much reflective of a revolt by educated, politically aware voters against this whole exercise. Where it's going to head, I'm not sure.
If you could identify a moment, it might have been during the election campaign when we got Standing Up for Australia and Moving Forward. Now, they were dreadful.
Oh, they were totally inane, and I think that's probably, in a sense, a low light that really does illustrate the problem. Now, election slogans, if you go back over the decades, have often been rather unedifying, but these two were absolute crackers. They were absolutely content-free, bland, meaningless, and so I think they really punctuate this problem.
Now, you write about the removal of Kevin Rudd, and you said that had some very powerful echoes of the sideshow syndrome. How so?
Well, I compare it with the period in 1995 under Paul Keating. I was a backbencher in my first term. 93, 94, we'd had this glorious victory in 93. We were walking on water.